So, I got a hot take. Society needs to stop telling men to empathize, to feel what others are feeling. In this video, I'm going to try and convince you that a healthier and more realistic form of masculinity is to practice what Paul Bloom, professor of cognitive science at Yale University, calls rational compassion. In his book, Against Empathy, he makes the point that empathy isn't just a bad idea, but it's irresponsible, unethical, and, well, immoral. Now, before you stop this video because you think I'm just being sensational, I will say there are benefits to the right kind of empathy. In fact, there are two kinds of empathy. There's emotional empathy, which is the empathy I'm going to make the case you should abstain from. And there's cognitive empathy, the more useful, caring form of empathy. Emotional empathy is all about the feelings. This is when you actually feel another person's emotions, whereas cognitive empathy requires quote-unquote theory of mind, or the ability to imagine what that other person is thinking. So emotional empathy amplifies another's emotions so much that they become our own emotions, and cognitive empathy zooms in on another's thoughts, allowing us to understand what they're thinking. And sure, you may be thinking, can't I just have both, the feels and the thoughts? Well, not really. You see, fMRI machines have found that different brain regions light up when we are feeling empathy versus compassion. That is, if you were to vicariously feel a friend's distress, the pain portion of your brain would light up, as if you were experiencing that pain firsthand. But if you were feeling compassion toward that same friend who's in pain, regions of the brain associated with motivation and pro-social behavior would become activated. The idea that empathy is far less productive than compassion may be a quote-unquote hot take now, but it was known to Buddhist writers more than 2,000 years ago. In Buddhist texts, they distinguish the difference between quote-unquote sentimental compassion, which we all call empathy, and quote-unquote great compassion, or simply compassion. Enlightened beings, also called bodhisattvas, valued great compassion, as they knew that empathy would lead to suffering, whereas compassion would lead to the greater good. They understood that less empathy equals more kindness. But there's something else that makes empathy and compassion distinct, what we do in response to another's emotion. In a scientific review titled Empathy and Compassion, researchers Singer and Klemecki explain that empathic distress refers to a strong, aversive, and self-oriented response to the suffering of others, accompanied by the desire to withdraw from a situation in order to protect oneself from excessive negative feelings. Compassion, on the other hand, is conceived as a feeling of concern for another person's suffering, which is accompanied by the motivation to help. By consequence, it is associated with approach and pro-social behavior. So let's break it down. Let's say one of your boys just went through a brutal breakup and he's angry. Empathic distress would say, how could she have done that to you? Now I'm angry at her too. Now, rational compassion would say, I'm sorry you're feeling this way. I can't say I know exactly how you're feeling, but I'm here for you. But why is this relevant? Why should we, as men, care that there are two distinct forms of empathy, one having to do with emotions and the other having to do with theory of mind? Because one is incredibly effective at caring for others, while the other is, well, dangerous. Let's get into why the research says empathy does more harm than good. Problems with empathy. Empathy is weaponizable. If you watch the news, you know exactly what I mean when I say empathy is weaponizable. You see, the news is incredibly effective at performing what's called empathy traps, where viewers' empathetic responses are exploited in order to elicit extreme emotions for some gain. An example besides the 24/7 news cycle is a con artist using a sad story to gain someone's trust and then using that trust to take advantage of the empath. Also, when your emotions are hijacked by empathy, it leaves you vulnerable to what's called the availability bias, which refers to believing that information that comes readily to mind must be true. Information that's emotionally salient, flashy, and has been reinforced is most likely to pop into your mind first. For example, because of high-profile cases of men behaving egregiously, some people automatically assume that all men are pigs. Empathy leads to the weaponization of emotions, which inevitably leads to dehumanizing others. We see this happening when society erroneously generalizes unmanly behavior as representative of all men. In fact, now, the very essence of what it means to be a man is branded as toxic. Empathy leads to neglecting the many to save the few. In cognitive psychology, there's a cognitive bias known as identifiable victim effect. The identifiable victim effect comes to light when you watch those charity commercials and you feel more compelled to donate when there's a shot of one hungry little girl as opposed to a faceless crowd of people. Simply put, you feel more compelled to donate when there's one little girl on your screen as opposed to the village. Although helping the one over the many could at first be seen as laudable, barring a family member or a loved one, it is simply irrational. Let's take a look at an example. The Against Malaria Foundation and the incredibly honorable Make-A-Wish Foundation. According to Vox, the average cost in 2019 for one wish to come true was around $10,130. And according to Against Malaria Foundation, was $2 for every one insecticide bed net. Even though no one would ever say that money donated to Make-A-Wish Foundation is money unnecessarily spent. In fact, the same article I referenced by Vox was actually saying otherwise. From a consequentialist perspective, more people could be saved if just one Make-A-Wish donor made a contribution to the Against Malaria Foundation instead. Essentially, empathy leads to neglecting the many to save the few. Two quotes come to mind when it comes to this harmful effect. If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will. Mother Teresa. One death is a tragedy. A million deaths is a statistic. Joseph Stalin. Number 3, empathy contributes to in-group bias. Human beings naturally have a tendency to only care for a small group of people at a time. This is even true for babies. They prefer the same faces. This is evolutionarily beneficial because babies need to know who will come to their aid when they're hungry, in pain, or scared. But if left unchecked, this low-resolution facial recognition feature has the possibility to go from similar faces to similar skin color and even similar lived experiences. This phenomenon is so well studied in evolutionary psychology that it's called the cross-race effect, and our ability to distinguish familiar faces is just one of the many factors contributing to the cross-race bias. Regardless of the factors that contribute to the same race bias, one thing is certain: you are more efficient at recognizing the emotions of, i.e., empathizing, with people from your same race than those of other races. You can see how the own race effect extends far beyond the domain of mere race, the gender, sexual orientation, economic background, religion, etc. This bias is called in-group preference. Again, in referencing empathy and compassion, researchers wrote, empathic brain responses are modulated by factors that range from person-specific characteristics, such as gender, to context-specific factors. For example, in several fMRI studies in our own lab, we could show that perceived group membership or fairness of another person matters for how much empathy one will actually experience for the other. You see, in-group preference makes same race effect look like jaywalking compared to genocide. Because, well, in-group preference is kind of one of the main causes for mass genocide. Hitler wasn't just a sadistic, hateful anti-Semite. He was also a tremendously patriotic and proud German who thought his German people, quote, have suffered for too long, believing that it was his duty to, quote, make sure they never suffer again. He would go on to say, I feel a deep and abiding love for the German people that transcends all other considerations, and I have devoted my life to the betterment of the German people, and I will never stop until they are truly happy and prosperous. That sound like an unempathic man to you? So what do we know? Empathy is too weaponizable. Empathy causes us to neglect the many to save the one. And empathy contributes to cognitive biases such as availability heuristic, cross-race effect, and in-group preferences. Unchecked empathy has the potential to be incredibly harmful. And yet, despite me saying all of this, I still think empathy is a good thing. The question is, which empathy? Cognitive empathy or emotional empathy? The most effective way to helping the most amount of people is to have cognitive empathy over emotional empathy. It's worth noting, however, that cognitive empathy isn't the cure-all solution. Some degree of emotional empathy seems to be important. Psychopaths have a great theory of mind, but no emotional empathy. Gifted at knowing the fears of others, but also unremorseful when seeing the pain of someone else. So what's the solution? Enter rational compassion. Think about a doctor helping a patient in pain. An effective doctor cares about the pain of his patient, but doesn't become so entangled with their pain that they feel too distressed. Rather, his care for his patient's pain motivates him to use his expertise to provide the best possible care and treatment. This is rational compassion. When he says, I know what you are feeling, and I want to help you because I care for your well-being. Empathy is a tool that helps connect with others. Different types of empathy result in different tools. Emotional empathy is like a magnifying glass, turned inwards towards the self, and rational compassion is a camera lens that gives you the power to look at multiple perspectives at a higher resolution. If you look at the world through a magnifying glass, sure, you can zoom in on the emotions of the other person and feel what they feel. But because you're so zoomed in, it's all you can see. You can no longer be rational and have a wide enough perspective to provide care that is actually helpful and effective. In the end, rational compassion provides a wider depth of field and a sharper focus in an otherwise dark and irrational world. I hope this video helps you stumble just a little closer to a clearer, more rational, and compassionate world, but more than anything, I hope it can help you get just a little closer to becoming more formidable.